even keep the child with her, to give the child to God's service, just simply to have a child. So again, we have an example of, we've seen this theme, right? You have these barren women, right, that are faithful enough, right, are faithful enough in God to let him show his power. And so Hannah is faithful, and of course she conceives a son, and his name is Samuel. So when this happens, she gives him to the Lord, and Hannah, I always forget I have these slides, right? Hannah rejoices to the Lord, and I'm going to read this morning because I think it's really powerful, and it does set the tone for some of the themes we're going to see throughout these next couple books. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 2, beginning at the beginning of the chapter. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord, my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the Lord are the earth, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. All right, so for those of you who are reading ahead on the slides here, right, we have 3 big themes right through here. The big ones, of course, are that God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, right, which is fitting because, one, Hannah is humble, right? She humbly comes before God and exalts her, but we're also going to see that with the kings. That the humble ones are going to be more likely to be successful than those who are proud. We're also going to see that despite human evil, God is at work, right? We see, it says in verse 10, the adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. In verse 9, even when this wickedness is going on, it says he will guard the feet of the faithful ones. All right, and then lastly, this is a bit looser in my opinion, but there is some prediction here, right, of the Lord giving strength to his king, right, who eventually the king is Jesus, who comes through this. And we're going to see throughout these books, right, that there are allusions to Christ coming, this final king that's going to save Israel from their transgressions. Okay, so we're going to dive right on in here to King Saul. All right, so Israel says, we want a king. Okay, this is their final step to becoming like the nations around them. But they kind of do need a little bit of supervision, right? We see at the beginning of 1 Samuel, like the people basically trot out the Ark of the Covenant as this trophy in battle. They've forgotten God, but they see that the Ark as kind of their God, right? They've now made the Ark God, and they carry it around. Of course, they lose the battle. The Ark is stolen and taken by the Philistines, right? So they need a little bit of help here to begin with. But as always, right, God still delivers. Even with this, of course, the ark is being passed around the Philistines, and every camp it goes to, bad things seem to happen to the Philistines, right? There's plagues, there's death, their own gods are falling, and their idols are being shattered. Lots of negatives are happening to Israel, or to the Philistines, so they eventually give it back, and they say, look, you guys can have it. We don't want it, which is a very, very relatable thing. But they have this, and then they're going to say, in 1 Samuel 8, which I read last week, to kind of prepare us for this class, In chapter 8, verse 7, this is the Lord talking to Samuel. It says, the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So Israel is going to demand that they have a king, right? They're going to say, we want to be like all the other nations. Please give us a king. Samuel warns them, tells them this is not a good idea, but nevertheless, they still want a king. And I think it's fitting that in 1 Samuel 12, we basically see, Samuel again tells them that they've sinned, right, in his farewell address. But it's interesting. 1 Samuel 12, beginning in verse 19, it says, and all the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die. For we have added to all our sins this evil, to ask for ourselves a king. And Samuel said to the people, do not be afraid. You have done all this evil. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. For the Lord will not forsake his people, for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. And I will instruct you in the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. For consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. So, what I really like about that passage, is that everyone acknowledges, right? We've sinned, we've done the wrong thing, but now you've wanted a king, you have a king. The world's not going to end. Just keep serving God. God will continue to work for you, but let's just not make it worse. All right? And I think that's something we can all relate to. Right? We all have had sins in the past, right? That you can't undo. You've made your mistake. You have made a choice, and you can't just hit the rewind button and start over, right? But you can continue to serve God and work through that, and God will continue to faithfully work with you through that sin. Okay, so we have Saul, right? Some highlights of Saul, right? He's a man of the smallest tribe, right? The tribe of Benjamin. He says as much when he's asked, or when he's told, that he's going to be anointed as king. He is a man that does come from wealth, right? He comes from a humble tribe, but his father Kish does seem to come from wealth and have a lot going his way. And then, of course, he's an imposing figure. He's a tall guy. He has an attractive physique, right? He's everything that you would want, right? If you're just looking at the eye test for a king, right? He's got everything, especially in a time of war, right? When you're in a time of war, you want somebody who's big, who's strong, who's going to walk out in front of you and be impressive, right? In war, and he meets every single bit of that. But it's kind of funny. You had this really big guy, but this kind of gives you some idea. In 1 Samuel 10:22, when we look at Saul. Right, so Saul's being proclaimed king, and they're of course, doing the drawing of lots ceremony. And in verse 22, it says, so they inquired again of the Lord, is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage. Then they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. So you have this guy who's this big, strong guy who's supposed to be the pinnacle of what you want for a king, and he starts out hiding in the baggage because he doesn't want to come out as king, right? Which is just, I always think, is a very funny way to start as a king. I think it does kind of show to some extent, though. We talk a lot, and we will this morning, about Saul's arrogance and his struggles with pride, but he does seem to start at least with some level of humility, some level of, he does struggle with some confidence going into this role, which who wouldn't? But we do see that early on. Okay, so here's all those are all of his strengths, what he has going for him. But Saul is very quickly going to come up short in a lot of ways. His first thing is that he doesn't really have a strong faith in God, right? Or those around him, right? He doesn't trust. He's impatient with God. In 1 Samuel 13, I won't read the whole story, but basically Samuel was supposed to come to Saul. He was supposed to come to the camp to do the process of offering the sacrifices but before this battle. And Saul says, Samuel's taken too long, and Saul decides that he's going to offer sacrifices instead, right? He decides to take that upon himself, which, of course, is sinful. But when Samuel says, "Why have you done this? What are you doing?" He basically makes an excuse, which again is an issue of Saul's. Is he doesn't really want to take accountability when he makes mistakes, and he basically just says, "Look, I had not sought the favor of the Lord, so I felt like I needed to do the sacrifice," which again shows you a little bit about where Israel is in relationship with God. That when he hadn't sought the favor of the Lord, he didn't think, "Let me just talk to the Lord, let me pray to the Lord." He's just like, "Let me just go burn some stuff, right? Let me go burn some stuff to ask the favor of the Lord," instead of actually seeking his favor beforehand. So this is the first time when he does this in 1 Samuel 13 that we see this statement that your kingdom shall not continue, right? So this is God already telling Saul, okay, like you're kind of on, you're a dead duck now. Your family line will not continue. This will not be your kingdom forever. We're also going to see that he consults with a medium, kind of in a similar situation in 1 Samuel 28. This is actually him trying to communicate with Samuel. All right, he wants to talk to Samuel, but he uses a medium, which of course, when we look back at all the laws, right, that we did 2 weeks ago, consulting with a medium is like one of the big abominations, right, in Scripture. You would hope that God's king, anointed over all of his people, would know that, but nevertheless, he does. The second one is that he's kind of got a lack of confidence, as we saw at the beginning, but he's also kind of paranoid. We're going to see his lack of confidence often, right? But one specific example is in 1 Samuel 14:52. What all it says is, there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself, right? So he's always trying to attach himself to strong people. When we see that when Israel is successful, right, when we see that they're successful throughout all their battles, it's not because they have the mighty men, but that's not why they're successful. It's because they rely on God. It's because they allow God to do the heavy lifting for them. But nevertheless, he's always seeking something else, always seeking human might. He also, he says he thinks of himself too small. He talked about his tribe, right, being too humble. Him coming from the humblest clan and the humblest tribe. So he doesn't think that he can live up to it. And we also get that in 1 Samuel 15:17, where Samuel specifically says, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel?" Right? So Saul clearly has some issues there with confidence in who he is and what he can accomplish, which part of that is probably because he doesn't seem to have faith that God is going to deliver for him, right? He thinks everything's about him instead of putting his faith that God will take care of him. And then, to go to the paranoia, right? He kind of, we'll see it throughout, the end of 1 Samuel as Saul chases David around the wilderness, right? But he's got this paranoia, right? This constant thing that David is trying to take him down, despite the fact David on multiple occasions could kill him and chooses not to. Saul continues to think that David's trying to overtake him, when in reality, God is the one who's already told him in no uncertain terms that his time as king is numbered. Okay, so of course we see the arrogance and pride with Saul all the time. In 1 Samuel 14, I think is one of the more funny and ironic senses of pride, right? He wants to take vengeance, right? So they've defeated the Philistines, right, which he's been warring with, and then Saul makes this vow where he basically says, like, if anyone eats anything before we go and destroy all these people, like, they're going to be punished by death, right? And then turns out his own son Jonathan, who we saw earlier at the beginning of chapter 14, was the main catalyst for defeating the Philistines. He's the one that eats of this honey because he's famished. And so we have this super ironic situation where the king's son, who is pretty much his best soldier, is the guy who has to get put to death. But of course, the people actually stand up to Saul and say, like, no, no, we're not doing this. Like you're not gonna put him to death for this because it's just dumb, right? But it's all Saul's own pride and arrogance wanting to take these people down for vengeance. And then of course right after that in 1 Samuel 15:12, we see that after Saul fights all these enemies, right? In verse 12, he sets up a monument for himself, right? A monument for himself, his own, to celebrate his victories, right, over the Israelites. And that's just a couple examples. You see his arrogance throughout all of his battles, throughout all of his stories. But the last one is his just this blatant disobedience, right? So 1 Samuel 15, he's told to devote everything to destruction, but of course he takes the king alive, he takes all the choicest things back. The only things that he really destroys are things that are worthless to anyone, the things nobody wants anyway. He decides to destroy those. And of course, when Samuel says, what's going on here, right? Why are you doing this? Saul, of course, makes up, another excuse. He says that I was going to sacrifice all these things to God. Of course, all the things are still there. All the things are still alive, so we don't really know, right? But he makes this excuse that he was going to sacrifice these things, which leads to this, this great quote. All right, 1 Samuel 15:22, as the Lord is great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better to sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. So you see throughout, I've already mentioned a few times this morning, right? This whole theme through 1 Samuel, or especially the early part, is just like the people are detached, right? They think the sacrifice is how they connect with God. They think that that's the only way to connect with God, and they don't even really think about what they're doing. They just say, okay, we'll sacrifice, we're good, and they've kind of lost track of what they're really trying to do. All right, so I've skipped a lot of stuff here on the story of Saul. So I'm going to pause for a second. Anybody have any comments about things I've missed? Any questions right here about the life of Saul and his general character overview? I'm doing great, guys. Woo! Crushing this. No comments.
I like the theme of Hannah's song. It will be the recurring theme of all of Samuel, and the kings later on. That the one who is humble, God will raise him up, and the one who is arrogant, God will bring him down. And we see that cycle happening throughout the history of the kings, and especially it's the focus of Samuel, of the book of Samuel.
Okay, I'll talk. I think the life of Saul is so fascinating because it's so applicable today, to our lives, to my life. It's the thing of he doesn't outright reject God, but he ignores him until he wants something. And so I always think it's interesting that God continues to talk to him. He continues to try to reach him, and he just continues to ignore him.
Absolutely. All right, so we've seen the negative of Saul. Now we're going to see the rise of David, right? So David, where David's strengths, basically David is everything Saul wasn't at the beginning. Of course, I put my own little quote there. Let's try the opposite of that last guy, because that's basically what David is at the beginning, right? So David's strengths, right? He serves eagerly, right? Whereas Saul is very hesitant, right? At first, he doesn't want to be king. He doesn't want to do what God asked him to do. David basically says, you want me to go take something to my brothers? Sure, I'll take it to them. You want me to just take care of the sheep? I'll do that. Oh, you want me to play the harp for you? I'll do that. You never really see David not wanting to do what he's asked to do, right? And he serves so eagerly that he even continues to serve Saul even after Saul makes an initial attempt on his life, right? Saul throws a spear at him and tries to pin him to the wall. And of course, David gets out of there, but he still comes back and tries to serve him again, right? So this is a David who is very eagerly serving and continue to serve God. He has kind of almost a reckless faith in God, right? So this guy is, he goes out, right? As children, right? If you grow up in the church, get told the story of David and Goliath, right? He goes out. Nobody else in the army, these people who are allegedly trained to fight, nobody else wants to take him on, but this little guy shows up, right? No, he's not a little guy, but he shows up against this massive giant, and he says, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, because as a shepherd he's already defeated those, right, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Which, I think if I had defeated a lion and a bear, maybe I would feel more confident against a giant. I don't know. But he continues to just trust that God's going to deliver him. When Saul basically tries to entrap him a little bit by saying, hey, you can marry Michael, but by the way, to do so, you're going to have to basically bring back the foreskins of 100 Philistines, just basically telling him he has to go defeat, right, this group of 100 Philistines, bring them back. David's just like, okay, I'll do that. Brings back 200 instead, right? He continues to trust God and to continue to, and of course, he's successful because he does that, right? This is something I think that we struggle with a lot, right? Sometimes is we're not, I'm not telling you to go out and, jump out of a plane without a parachute, right? And trust God, but I think we limit God a lot in what he can do. We make decisions for ourselves about what we think we can and cannot pray to God about. I don't think we are as reckless in our faith to God as we see with David here. Of course, he is humble, right? He is humble, where, of course, Saul was not. And why wouldn't you come as humble? When he starts out, right, when Samuel first comes to anoint him, his own dad doesn't even consider him, right? His own dad basically, doesn't even acknowledge that he's there until they go through all the other sons. And then Samuel's like, is there anybody else? And then he's like, oh yeah, I do have this other son that's out, out in the field. But so, David is considered the least even of his own family. And then I think what's really cool about David's humility is throughout this story of Saul, of course is trying to kill him, but David has all these chances to do harm to Saul, and he doesn't, right? And he goes out of his way to show Saul that he doesn't want to harm him. And when it comes to it, right, it's all because he doesn't believe it's his job to destroy the Lord's anointed. And we're going to see that in his king behavior as well. So it's kind of funny once he's kind of starting to take over, right? You have these people who bring what they consider as good news, right? They come to David wanting to basically tout victory. In the first case with Saul, a guy takes credit for killing Saul when he didn't even do it, right? Saul fell on his own sword. This guy comes and says, hey, I killed Saul. And he's thinking he's going to be met with, a parade, the great riches, I'm the one that killed your enemy. And instead, David basically says, okay, why did you think you could kill the Lord's anointed, and sentences him to death and executes him pretty much right there, right? So, and you see that again. You see that again later as well, that he's going to greet good news with the death penalty for killing someone that you were not told to kill, right? So he basically, as part of this, right, he doesn't even really seem during his rise to care about the benefits of being a king, right? Whereas it seems like Saul very quickly, adapts to that, I'm a king, I'm going to do whatever I want. David really, he seems like he just wants to follow God, right? He's just in the wilderness. You see a lot of the Psalms, right, coming from David while he's in the wilderness, and you see this trust, this faith in God throughout that time in the wilderness as he comes up through the ranks here. So we come to this pinnacle, right, in 2 Samuel 7, okay, where, David has been, David's been serving God faithfully, and he finally has a little bit of a break, right, from all the warring with everybody. Basically, he thinks he has a great idea, which is look, God, you've been in this tent for years. We've been worshiping you in this tent. Let's make you something permanent. Let's make you something nice, right, that we can go worship you in and give you a permanent dwelling. But then God pretty much says, thanks, but no thanks. I'm good for now. I'll just keep being in my tent. But what I'm going to do is instead of you building me a house, I'm going to establish your house. So in 2 Samuel 7, he's going to make several promises to David here. right? The first, of course, is that his name is going to be great, right? He's going to be, he's going to be known throughout the world, right? We eventually see, David calls Jerusalem the city of David, right? The name of David is well known, and of course, it's well known even to this day. We see a permanent home for Israel, right? They're no longer going to be, running around fighting everyone all the time. Hopefully, if they follow here, they're going to have a permanent home in Israel, in the Promised Land. We also see in verse 10 that they're going to have peace from war. We don't really see that come to fruition during David's lifetime, right? And we are going to see it off and on throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. But eventually, of course, we get that peace, right? The peace of Christ coming for us, which again is alluded to in verse 12 and 13. So, God is setting up David, right? And this is one where we've had conditional statements throughout the Old Testament, right? If you do this, I will set you up. But God tells David here, I'm not going to abandon your family. He says, I will discipline you. I will discipline you. I will discipline your people. I'm not going to, alleviate all consequences, but I will not abandon you, right? Which with Saul, of course, like he did. He basically said, I've rejected you. I'm done with you. Your kingdom will not last. We're moving on. Okay, so this is big, of course, because we know that Christ comes from the line of David, right? And so we're always going to see God fulfill that promise to David and his family, even if things do take some twists and turns along the way. So David's great, right? Everything's great about David so far. We feel really good about him, right? But as with any great performance review, we have some things that need improvement. So David, of course, like most people that are put in power, eventually are going to see some weaknesses pop up. So his first one is that he kind of gets a bit lazy, right? We see the story of Bathsheba, right, where he takes her as his wife. But the whole reason that opportunity was even presented is because it says in the spring when the kings go out to battle, he doesn't go out to battle. He's hanging out at his house. He's basically entrusted everything to Joab. Joab's leading the army, and David's just kind of sitting in the back seat, sitting at home, right? We're also going to see, that laziness, because there's multiple times throughout 2 Samuel, especially, where you're going to see this idea where the kings go out to battle, but David's not at battle. David's at home and trusting someone else to do that. His second one is that he, much like Saul, becomes too reliant on physical might, right? He begins to accrue military power, right? We see in 2 Samuel 8, right? Okay, yeah, in verse 4, it says, David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots, right? He starts trying to collect military, right? He starts trying to collect resources. He does destroy most, but still collects some military strength. And again, in some of his later battles, you see again, he's all about his military might. We see, again, he's becoming more and more like Saul, right? He's kind of going into this arrogance and pride. Of course, we talked about Bathsheba, right? That's a lot of arrogance, right? Basically saying, look, I don't care if that's another man's wife. I'm just going to take her because I can, because I'm the king, right? That's the most arrogant thing you can possibly do, and he does so. But the one I want to focus on this morning is, I believe, in 2 Samuel 24. Nope, I'm in the wrong spot. Yeah, 2 Samuel 24. All right, I put 1 Samuel for some reason, but it's 2 Samuel. Okay, so in 2 Samuel 24, David decides to take a census, right? And all of this is because he wants to number the people. Again, it's just arrogance. I want to know how much military might I have. God says, of course, this is sinful. You shouldn't be doing this. Gives him the option of 3 different punishments: famine, fleeing for 3 months, or 3 days of pestilence. This kind of gets to David's laziness again, right? But he chooses that he'd rather have 3 days of pestilence because he's banking on the grace of God. God says, okay, and 70,000 Israelites die during that 3-day period. So again, rather than him fleeing for 3 months where we don't know if anyone will die and taking that upon himself, he instead loses 70,000 of his own people. So we are quickly running out of time here. But David's going to live in constant turmoil through his life, right? He's fighting or fleeing from Canaanites, his own king, right? From Saul. He's fleeing from his own children. He's fleeing from the Canaanites again. He's constantly at battle, right? So he has 40 years as king, both in Hebron and Jerusalem, but he's constantly struggling, right? And part of that is par for the course, right? With trying to establish a new monarchy. But some of it is the result of his weakening grip on things, as we see with his son Adonijah basically claiming the throne at the end of his life without David even having any knowledge. Adonijah just goes and sets it up. Of course, he's sick, he's ill, but Adonijah does that without him. But his work does lead to a time of peace with Solomon. So Solomon, there's a lot of positives in Solomon's life, right? He famously asked for wisdom to rule effectively in 1 Kings 3, right? When God gives him pretty much a blank check to ask for whatever he wants, he asks for wisdom. We see peace and prosperity. We don't see Solomon battling, throughout his time as ruler. We see Solomon, God actually does task Solomon during this time of peace with building him a temple. We also see a new palace built for Solomon. And then we have a very insightful prayer in 1 Kings 8, which I'm not going to have time to read due to our time constraints this morning. But Solomon, beginning in verse 22, I'll actually read the entirety of chapter 8. But Solomon makes a very very insightful prayer that ensures his people's future. I mean, you can tell he kind of knows. Maybe he knows what's going to happen. Maybe he doesn't. But basically protects them during some of their exiles, and the Lord brings them back. But it's very interesting to read that prayer. So it's great. Like when you read through the time of Solomon, like he's only really on the throne for about 7 chapters, right, of 1 Kings, and it's mostly good, right? You see all this good stuff, and then in chapter 11, you basically see that all these things that were good aren't necessarily good. All right, so I mentioned at the beginning of class Deuteronomy 17, and I encourage you guys to, actually, I might have time. Let's see. Working on the fly here. So in Deuteronomy 17, the laws concerning Israel's kings. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. He shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Okay? I'm going to stop there just due to time. But when we read that, and then let's compare that to what Solomon actually did. So in 1 Kings 10:26, as Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen, he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Do not acquire many wives, right? Solomon takes wives from all kinds of places, right? All kinds of cities that he shouldn't have, all kinds of nations he shouldn't have, including his first one being an Egyptian. And in verse 3, it says he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. I think most people would agree that constitutes many right here. And then we see, it says, do not acquire excessive silver and gold, right? And in verse 23, again, we see, that King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, right? We see there's times where it says that silver was more plentiful. Silver was basically as plentiful as stone, right? And these nice cedars is as common as just like the basic sycamore, right? In Israel. Yeah, it's actually verse 27. I think I've got the wrong verse up there. Yeah, verse 27. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and made silver as plentiful as the sycamore. So, despite having this seemingly awesome life, right? God blessed him with wisdom. God blessed him with all these things. He still basically forgets, right, or decides, kind of Dee's point earlier, he decides to start kind of ignoring what's got him to this point. He just enjoys all this wealth, all this wisdom, and forgets a bit about what God wants him to have. And in the end, we see at the end of his reign that God says, like, your kingdom is not going to last. I'm going to give you I'm going to give you Judah, but most of Israel is going to go to somebody else. So, God, again, is punishing, right? As he said he would to David, that he would punish but not abandon. And he's doing that here with Solomon. Oh, wrong way. All right, so what can we learn? Kind of three big lessons here this final minute of class, right? We going all the way back to Hannah. All right, God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, right? We saw David was humble. He was exalted. Saul was brought low. Solomon starts humble, but then he clearly excels, so much so that he also is prideful and does what God does not ask and abandons God a bit, and so he is punished. Solomon, again, it's sometimes easier to forget God when things are going well, right? It's very easy to remember to pray to God when things are going awful. God, why'd you do this? God, please deliver me from this. But then sometimes we get so comfortable in how good our lives are that then it's all us, right? We did this. I acquired this, and we forget about God. As we've seen with every leader, nobody's perfect, and that's okay. David wasn't perfect. Solomon wasn't perfect. Saul certainly wasn't perfect. But each of them still fulfilled some purpose of God. And then as we go back to, again, to Hannah, God is always at work, even when evil is on the earth, as we're going to continue to see in the coming weeks. All right, so next week, turn it over to Jordan here. It gets worse next week. All right, we're going to have a divided kingdom. Israel's going to get first look at that. And yeah, hope y'all buckle up for some more exciting times in the Old Testament.
Yeah. 500 years of history in 35 minutes, so it'll be fun.
Thank you, guys. If you have any comments, you can just talk to me up here. Thanks.